It's a case I first heard about maybe 1970s when I read a chapter in Dennis Ogawa's book, Junkin Law. And I teach the Japanese in Hawaii course in the Ethnic Studies department. So I lectured about the case for many years, about decades really. But I never thought about doing research on this case because I assumed I would have to be able to read Japanese to find out what the...
You need a mic, they cannot hear you.
You gotta close the door.
Okay, I'll try to speak.
Microphone.
I assumed I had to be able to read Japanese to find out what the Japanese newspapers, the Hawaii Hochi and the Nikko Jiji, were writing about the case. But when I went to the archives at the Hamilton Library, I found that there's this vast literature about the case because the Star Bulletin and the Advertiser were also writing about the case. And so that's when I decided, wow, this is something I can look further into. And once I looked at the archive, so much material there was, I decided, well, I can write a book now. There's so much information here, and including the trial transcripts, jury selection, the legal appeals that were filed, the responses, the motions, all that legal stuff. And so my interest, though, as a member of the Ethnic Studies Department, or more generally as a scholar, is race and ethnicity. So this is how I research and write about the case, primarily in terms of its racial significance. What does it tell us about how race operated in Hawaii in the 1920s? This decade that I refer to as the height of the anti-Japanese movement because of their leadership and participation in the 1920 strike, which began promptly in January of 1920. So I haven't written what might be called a true crime story, focused on the murder itself, but I included a lot of local information about the case because people like you would be able to make connections, different places, different events that you're familiar with. So how many of you know where Miles Fukunaga is buried, for example? Yeah, I'll say. I mean, we could all walk there maybe 20 minutes. Really, huh? And the other references I make to downtown Honolulu, where he was living and working, and where he met Gil Jameson, his victim's father, across from the Academy of Arts on
Okay, so since he's already begun, I will go ahead and do my introduction. Jonathan Okumura, as you know, is a professor at the University of Hawaii, Department of Ethnic Studies, and he is a Yonsei from Maui.
Something and a half.
Okay, he attended USC for his BA in anthropology and mathematics and completed his PhD in anthropology at the University of London. And we're so pleased to have him here today to talk about his new book, Race to Death, which of course all of you know analyzes the Miles Fukunaga case of 1928. So without further ado, Professor Okamura.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me thank Audrey and Ken Yoshida and the JCCH for hosting me today and organizing this get-together where I can talk about my book. And I gave you a little background about the book. You must be a veteran. Okay. What I'll do is, first I'm going to start with some slides, some visuals about Gil Jameson and Miles Fukunaga and some aspects of the case, including newspaper headlines that appeared very early, and his parents at the funeral. I was hoping some members of the Fukunaga family might be here because I had a former student whose grandmother was Miles Fukunaga's sister, who identified him for the police when they arrested him on that Saturday afternoon, September 22nd. Okay, So let me start with those slides. I like to start with a picture of Gil Jameson, the victim, 10 years old, Punahou student, because I represent Fukunaga as a victim of the anti-Japanese movement. So it's easy to kind of forget about Gil and what happened to him, this innocent young boy. This is a picture that appeared the day after his kidnapping in the local newspapers provided by his parents, as he was very recently attending school. You can see he's barefoot, huh? So myself, growing up on Maui, I never wore shoes to school until I went to high school because you had to at that point. You couldn't be barefoot anymore. But Miles Fukunaga's mugshot is what I use on the cover of the book. You know, he was 5 feet tall, very slight stature, maybe 110 pounds. During the trial, he was likened as a boy because of his small size. Some commentary during this period that he was good looking for a Japanese boy. Example of the newspaper headlines that appeared, actually they appeared the very evening, September 22nd, after he had been arrested and confessed to the police. There were extra editions of the Star Bulletin, my Star Bulletin front page, for some reason disappeared. So this is the Advertiser, and both papers would have numerous articles about the Fukunaga case for the next maybe 10 days to 2 weeks about the case. But this is the result of his confession to the police the day he was captured, including references to him as the slayer of Gil Jameson, who had confessed to the police about his crime. And much of this information that was printed from the confession came from William Heen, member of the Heen family, well known in Democratic Party politics. He was referred to during this period as Judge Heen. He was one of the first Native Hawaiian, probably the first Native Hawaiian judge. He was a Democrat and appointed by Woodrow Wilson. Then he would serve in private practice also, and was prosecuting attorney in the Massey rape trial 3 years later. There's a lot of connections between the two cases because they occurred just 3 years apart from each other. But this is, from this first page, you get an idea of what was going on. A community fund that was organized by the Honolulu Chamber of Commerce by Wednesday, the day after the kidnapping. I'll refer to these dates. The kidnapping was on September 18th. So the next day, at an emergency meeting of the Honolulu Chamber of Commerce, they decided to organize a fundraising drive, and they immediately came up with about $28,000 for information leading to the capture and arrest of the kidnapper initially of Gil Jameson, because he wasn't found until 2 days later, his body on Thursday. This is the funeral of Miles Fukunaga. He was buried the same day of his execution, November 19, 1929. Those of you who are old Japanese Americans like myself probably know that this comes from a long photograph. I only have a portion of it. Yeah, you've seen those, maybe 4 or 5 feet. Yeah. And so in these photographs, the closest members of the family are the ones, of course, closest to the casket. So I assume this is Miles Fukunaga's father, his mother, his oldest sister, Yuriko, and one of these younger sisters. Perhaps this is my former student's grandmother named Harue, who was 12 years old at the time. He had 6 younger siblings, and the youngest was his brother Henry. These are, well, the relatives, descendants of his siblings, are the ones, I believe, who take flowers, candy, fruits to his grave, Mo'iliili, every Christmas. It's not as though the Fukunaga family has disappeared in Hawaii. So this is his gravestone. How many of you have seen the gravestone? Yeah. Because it's so easy to find. It's so tall, and down here there's a 2-foot concrete base. And it's on natural stone, unlike most of them which are polished granite. And, well, of course, this doesn't say Fukunaga. This is his Buddhist name, huh? That he was given at the time of his death. No? What is it?
It says Ingazuka. It has nothing to do with his Buddhist name. I think it's
Oh, I think maybe the Buddhist name was down here then, yeah. So what, oh yeah, that's right. What does that mean then? I've heard different translations of this.
Inga means cause and effect.
Yeah.
I think in Buddhist thinking, everything is a result of a cause.
Mhm.
So it could be a good effect as a result of a good cause, or in this case, a bad effect as a result of a bad cause. That's all it's like.
Yeah, one of my former Japanese students, who was fluent in English, she went to, did her PhD at Kyoto University, told me it kind of loosely translated, it refers to someone who had bad fate as a result, like what you did, something he did. She said loosely translated. It's kind of referring to the murder. Okay, so let me give some background about Miles Fukunaga. Like many Nisei, that wasn't his real name. He was born Yutaka, and I believe he probably took the name Miles when the family moved to Honolulu in 1925. But he was born at the plantation Makaweli, Kauai. He was the chonan, the oldest son in the family, and he took those responsibilities very seriously. And as I said, he had 6 younger siblings, and this resulted in the poverty of the Fukunaga family, which was one of the factors in the killing of Gil Jameson. The family moved to Wailua on the North Shore here, and then in December, and then he continued to attend a grade school, graduated the head of the class. He was a very bright student who enjoyed writing. He wrote for the school newspaper. He displayed the writing and the crime in his ransom letter, his letter to the Star Bulletin, some other writings he had in his room in reference to the crime. But he had to spend the summer picking pineapple with his father near Wahiawa. And then the family moved to Honolulu downtown in September of 1925. I'm not sure where they were living initially, but at the time of the crime, they were living near the intersection of Beretania and Alapai Streets, near Queens Hospital. This is where both he and his father found work immediately after they moved to Honolulu. Now, Fukunaga was, by the accounts of his teachers and other students who knew him, a very bright student who loved reading. He would go constantly to the downtown library, to the Nuuanu Y, Central Y, to read. He bought magazines. But he was very unhappy with his life. Lonesome, no friends. He said, books are my only friends. And so being so very depressed, he tried to kill himself in April of 1928. He also was probably insane. We don't know for sure because the examination of him by 3 court-appointed psychiatrists was not lengthy enough to come to a determination of his legal insanity, especially. I'm going to emphasize the difference between legal insanity and just being mentally insane. So, after the family moved to Honolulu, I had problems with my slides. That's one of the reasons I don't like PowerPoint necessarily. Fukunaga, living in downtown Honolulu, could have easily attended McKinley High School. He could have walked there, or he could have taken the trolley car down King Street. So he referred to this after he had been arrested and told the police, this was the biggest disappointment in my life, that I couldn't continue my education, because he liked school and he knew he was a bright student. So again, we're fast forwarding on this in his background, and I'll come back to the details of the crime subsequently, but After the appeals of his conviction all failed, ultimately going to the Supreme Court, he was hanged in November of 1929. He left 4 letters for his attorney, Robert Murakami, his oldest sister, Yuriko, and the chaplain at Oahu prison. And he signed them James, because he had converted to Catholicism perhaps 2 weeks after being sentenced to death. I think the reason is the chaplain was a Catholic, because he had also spoken to a Methodist minister after he was sentenced to death. Okay, the crime itself, the kidnapping and killing of Gil Jamison, 10-year-old Punahou student. They lived up in Manoa Valley and Kahavai Street. The house is still there on the left side. Now, he became the victim because his father, Frederick, worked for the Mine Trust Company. The father came from Scotland, 1910, and he had 2 other brothers who were living in Honolulu who worked for Big 5 companies at the time of the killing. I'm not sure why they came, how they came, if they came together or not, but his background, the father's background, his father was an ironmonger. You know, he didn't necessarily come from a privileged background in Scotland, but nonetheless he worked for a bank first in his hometown in Scotland, and then eventually came to Honolulu and became a very prominent vice president of Hawaiian Trust. Now, Hawaiian Trust managed the leasing of the home the Fukunaga family was renting in downtown Honolulu. The home was owned by the Heen family, and this is another kind of factor in the involvement of Heen. But Heen was at Hawaiian Trust meeting with Frederick Jamison when Frederick Jamison received a ransom letter. They were talking about financial matters handled by Hawaiian Trust for the Heen family. So, and he was friends with Frederick Jamison. So this is how William Heen became directly involved in the case subsequently. And the kind of command center for the police and the investigation was at William Heen's office in the same building. The police kind of got marginalized after Heen kind of sort of interjected himself in the investigation. So Fukunaga had quit his job at the Queen's Hospital in March of 1928 because he had been promised a $5 raise he was getting $40, and twice he had been promised, twice it was not forthcoming, so he finally quit. Now, as the chonan, of the $40 he was earning each month, he turned over $35 to his parents to help them support the family. So the remaining $5 he spent on movies. This is another one of his pursuits besides reading that he enjoyed very much, and he also bought magazines too to read. But so he was at home when the rent collector came to the Fukunaga family to collect $20 in overdue rent, and this person spoke very harshly to Fukunaga's mother, who did not speak English very well. So he went out to speak to the rent collector, and afterwards he told the police that he thought this was very unfair. A rich company like Hawaiian Trust could not wait a little while for the $20 in overdue rent. He said, I told him, we don't have any money. Can't you just wait until I find work, and therefore I can help my parents pay this money? So he developed, as he said, a plan by which he would get revenge against the company. He subsequently found work, though, at the Seaside Hotel, now the site of the International Marketplace on Kalakaua Avenue. But he quit that job also right before September, and started his more concrete plans for the kidnapping of Gil from Punahou. Okay? After his capture, he gave 3 reasons for why he committed this crime. The first was to send his parents back to Japan because they were so poor in Hawaii that they wanted to return, but this was impossible for a family that poor as they were. So his idea was to obtain ransom money, go to San Francisco for 6 months, then to return to Hawaii and give the money to his parents. And then he would turn himself into the police. The other reason he gave was he wanted to die, having failed in his 2 suicide attempts, being so unhappy, depressed with his life. So he said, well, by committing this crime, I could solve 2, what would you call them, issues, help my parents and also die. He alluded to this desire for revenge. It wasn't as concrete, explicit as his first 2 motives, but he did say, well, I had a little desire for vengeance. But he was copying these 2 other well-known murder cases that had occurred earlier, the 1924 Leopold and Loeb case, 2 brilliant University of Chicago students who kidnapped 14-year-old Bobby Frames. And when I say copying, this is evident in Fukunaga asking for $10,000 in ransom, as they did. Killing Gil Jameson with a chisel, as they did their victim, and also sending flowers to the Jameson family, as they did to the victim's parents. He was also copying another well-known case early in the year, 1928, the Hickman case. A guy named Edward Hickman had kidnapped a young schoolgirl by calling her school and saying that her father had been injured in a car accident and wanted to see her, and he was coming from the hospital where her father was, and he would take this young girl to see her father. So in Fukunaga's case, he called Punahou and said Gil Jameson's mother had been in a traffic accident, and he was coming from Queens Hospital, and he would take Gil to see her mother, his mother rather. Instead, he went down Kalakaua Avenue in a rented cab and got off at the site of the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, I think because he wanted to throw the police off. And then crossed Kalakaua Avenue, went through the grounds of the Seaside Hotel. He had been living back of the Seaside Hotel in these cottages for workers during the summer, and crossed over towards the Alawa Canal. This is where kiawe trees were at this time, and this is where he killed Gil Jameson later in the morning. And so this is again copying the $10,000 ransom, but he started spending the money immediately that evening after he had collected from Gil Jameson's father. This is missing information. He sent a ransom letter to Gil Jameson's father the afternoon of the killing on September 18th, and said he would be calling, someone would be calling, and he didn't identify who he was, would be calling later that evening for a meeting to collect the $10,000. And so he met Gil Jameson's father, Frederick, outside of the Academy of Arts. And then he told him to drive around to the McKinley High School baseball field. And this is where Frederick Jameson started to count the money. And he got to $4,000 in $5 bills and said, well, I'm not going to give you any more. He saw a couple of other men nearby, so he called out for help, and Fukunaga got scared and then left and ran down to Keamoku Street and then caught a cab and went downtown Honolulu. But again, he didn't ask to be taken to this rooming house where he was staying called the Serene Rooms on Kukui Street, because that would again tell the police how to find him. But the serial numbers were published in the newspapers, and this is how a $5 bill that he spent when he went to Waialua on Friday, visiting the place where he had succeeded as a student, was then traced back, and people in Waialua identified him subsequently, and police closed in on the family on Saturday. Okay, now, one of my interests from the title, you could tell, is racial injustice. This occurs throughout the case, even before Fukunaga was arrested, in the beating of the first suspect, a guy named Harry Kaisan Nisei, who was the former chauffeur of the Jameson family. Now, Fred Makino was the publisher of the Hawaii Hochi newspaper, the rival of the Nipu Jiji, And his newspaper talked about the two kinds of justice in Hawaii at this time, one for haoles, one for non-haoles, particularly Japanese Americans. And the reason Fukunaga was subject to this violence, was subject to this racial injustice, why he was so quickly sentenced to death, is because for haoles, he had violated the dominant racial boundary, separating them from non-haoles, particularly Japanese, viewed as the most threatening group to haole supremacy in Hawaii. You may find that surprising to hear, unless you're familiar with Japanese American history. By 1900, the largest group in Hawaii, 40% of the population. By the 1920s, the majority of Japanese in Hawaii are US citizens, like Fukunaga and his siblings, born in Hawaii. Haoles could easily see, once they became of age, they would be able to vote and vote them out of office, because the haole population had always been very small in Hawaii. At the time of the overthrow, perhaps 5% in 1893. And only in the 1920s, as a result of the military buildup, does the haole population increase. But haoles saw Japanese as the greatest political, economic, cultural threat to their continued supremacy. Economic, because they organized these large strikes on the plantations, 1909, 1920. The first multi-plantation strikes cost planters millions of dollars in losses. Culturally threatening because they didn't assimilate. Continued speaking Japanese, started Japanese language schools, which came under attack in the 1920s. 1927 was the case finally settled by the Supreme Court that ruled these various laws, policies of the territorial government and the Department of Public Instruction as unconstitutional. And also unassimilable because they maintained the Buddhist religion in Hawaii. In 1920, the Buddhist priests supported the Japanese plantation strikers. So there's another factor in their attacks. So in the title of my book, Race to Death, I use race with two different meanings. One is in terms of how Fukunaga was viewed as Japanese, of the Japanese race. Race being a very common term to refer to all the different groups in Hawaii, the Hawaiian race, the Chinese race, as opposed to him being prosecuted, treated as an individual without regard to race, which was his constitutional right, but this was not certainly the practice of the law in the 1920s. The other meaning of race that I use in the book is he was rushed or raced very quickly to his conviction and execution. Well, not the execution, but conviction and death sentence within 3 weeks of the killing on September 18th. Well, a little more than 2 weeks after his arrest, but less than 3 weeks after the killing on September 18th, he was sentenced to death on October 8th. Another racial injustice. He was very likely mentally insane based on the observations by a Navy doctor, Joseph Thompson, and I'll turn next to a UH professor named Lockwood Myrick. So Thompson had been following the case in the newspapers and reading about the trial, the testimony, and he was approached by the Nipujiji. Somebody there knew him and said, well, what's your opinion about Fukunaga's sanity? And he said he's insane. And they asked him to take out an affidavit stating that this was part of the first motion for, first appeal of the conviction and a request for a full psychiatric exam of Fukunaga. And so when they went to court, the judge excoriated Thompson by saying, well, you may claim Fukunaga's mentally insane, but you haven't addressed the issue of whether or not he's legally insane. Legally insane means, at that time, one cannot tell the difference between right and wrong. And this is not an issue that Thompson directly addressed in his affidavit. But there's another factor in the 1925 Hawaii Insanity Act that was not addressed by the judges, the prosecuting attorneys, the 3 psychiatrists who were appointed by the court to examine Fukunaga. And this is the issue brought up by Jewish professor Lockwood Myrick. And Myrick was not a psychologist, he was a philosophy professor. But he wrote that he had more than 20 years experience in diagnosing and treating the insane. I think this is a reference to his father, who was institutionalized. But he followed the case very closely. He also did interviews with Fukunaga's parents, of course, through an interpreter. He interviewed others, his teachers, his supervisors at work, and he wrote this very lengthy study, 40 pages in published text. It's not a letter. No? It was titled An Open Letter to Governor Wallace Farrington regarding Fukunaga's insanity. But it is an academic study, very detailed research about his conclusion that Fukunaga was legally insane according to the Hawaii Insanity Act. Another criterion was, besides being unable to distinguish between right and wrong, that if one was compelled by a force one could not withstand, then one could be judged legally insane. And for Lockwood Myrick, that force was Fukunaga's desire for revenge that drove him to kill Gil Jameson. And he claimed that Fukunaga was unaware of this. One of the, what would you say, similarities in the judgments of the Navy Dr. Thompson and Lockwood Myrick is Fukunaga's dissociative personality. He was losing touch with reality by his constant reading, going to movies. He was losing this ability to understand the reality of his life. And Myrick said all he really needed was just one friend with whom he could talk to and discuss his goals, his dreams for himself, and perhaps his plans for killing, and this would have prevented the crime. So continuing with the racial injustices in the case, the attorneys were both appointed by the judge. There were prominent attorneys. One was a former U.S. Attorney General in Hawaii, Seba Huber. But they're the ones who proposed that the trial start on October 1st with jury selection. They were appointed a week after the crime, September 25th. And so as the trial did start on October 1st, that gave them 6 days to prepare, which is far too short. But I believe they're also part of this effort to race Fukunaga to his death. Other ways in which they did not provide a zealous defense to Fukunaga is when it came to their turn to present their defense, all they did, the only witness they called was to recall the city medical examiner for 19 minutes. And that was how long the defense of Fukunaga presented by them was 19 minutes. They called no other witnesses. Who could they have called? His parents, his close relatives, his supervisors at work, former schoolmates, many of whom have been interviewed by the newspapers, and all of whom said this killing is totally inconsistent with his character. They can't understand how the Mas Fukunaga they knew could have committed such a violent crime. He had never been in trouble with the law before, never done anything rough like this. The worst legal blunder made by his attorneys, though, was on the first day of the trial. And the trial only took 2 days in terms of witness testimony. they stipulated that Fukunaga killed Gil Jameson. In other words, they admitted their client, Fukunaga, did the killing. This takes place in murder trials to this day. But attorneys then follow it an affirmative defense, saying, well, yes, my client did the killing, but he was insane at the time. Or, my client did the killing, but he was acting in self-defense. They presented no such defense for Fukunaga. So it's not surprising that after the jury got the case, they returned an hour 45 minutes with a guilty verdict. Okay, the problem with jury selection. The case, as I showed you from the headlines on the day after the killing, in which Fukunaga's state says that he did the killing and he confessed. All of them had read about the case before, and then they were asked, well, have you formed an opinion about his guilt or innocence? And some would say, well, most said, yes, I have, but I've set that opinion aside and I can give him a fair trial. This is highly unlikely, given the massive publicity to the case and the wording itself of Fukunaga confessing. One of the worst examples to me of how Fukunaga's attorneys did not exclude jurors from the case was one of them asked these potential jurors, when you saw his picture in the newspapers, Fukunaga, did the question arise, why did he do it? And they said, yes, that's it. Which to me is an indication, yeah, they agreed that he had killed Gil Jameson, as opposed to the presumption of innocence Fukunaga should have been given. At that point, once they said that, they should have been dismissed from the jury through what's called peremptory challenges. The defense had 12 peremptory challenges, which means that you can have a juror excluded without stating any specific reason, as opposed to a challenge for cause, which has to have a reason, and that reason has to be approved by the judge. So at the end of the trial, the defense still had 4 peremptory challenges, which they could have used to exclude the most biased jurors from the case, those who openly expressed their view that Fukunaga was guilty, had committed the crime, those who said they were personal friends of Gil Jameson's father, or the defense attorneys, or prosecution attorneys, rather. Because they're all part of this Haole elite in Honolulu at that time. So when this guy named Arthur Wall, I think, who became the jury foreman, was asked by one of Fuku's attorneys, do you know the prosecuting attorney, Charles Davis? And he did know him because after the kidnapping of Gil Jameson, he had offered his car, his driver, and his personal services to Charles Davis, who was his friend, of course. But this was not thought to be so unusual that he would have been dismissed from the jury, because they all knew each other. And this is what this guy Wall said, I know you all, because they're all part of this Haole elite in Honolulu. And so for Fukunaga's attorneys to question them, if they could really set aside this view in their minds that Fukunaga was guilty, it would be like questioning them if they're really stating the truth under oath on the stand when they're being questioned to be members of the jury. There was one Japanese American, Shinji Maruyama, on the jury. He was the English language editor of the the Nipujiji, the rival newspaper now of the Hawaii Ho-Chi. And you might think, well, this gives Fukunaga an opportunity to be found not guilty. All it takes is one juror, and you've got a hung jury. Well, Yasutaro Soga, the publisher of the Nipujiji, and Fred Makino, publisher of the Hawaii Ho-Chi, were bitter rivals by this time. They had been allies in the 1909 strike as leaders, but before the 1920 strike, they really hated each other personally, and newspapers traded these very hostile exchanges in the editorials regularly. So Maruyama knew how his boss, Yasutaro Soga, wanted him to vote in this case. And so in his case, he was asked during jury selection, not only if he had read anything about the case, if he had written anything about the case. And one of the articles he wrote was The Confession of Miles Fukunaga, in which he said, yeah, Fukunaga did the killing. How could they allow this guy to be in the jury? Huh? Well, let's skip point 9. This is an issue regarding how capital punishment was issued during this period. But what I also want to mention is how the Japanese American community understood, after Fukunaga had been sentenced to death, that this death sentence was not just about his guilt for the killing of Gil Jamison, but it was really directed against the Japanese American community, which was being given a warning not to challenge Hale supremacy in Hawaii, as they had done before, with the challenges to the laws by the territorial government to restrict the operations of the Japanese language schools, which went through the courts and was successful on the part of the Japanese community, or no longer organize multi-plantation strikes as they had done in 1909, 1920. And so I think understanding the context of the anti-Japanese movement during this period, the Japanese community got very involved in supporting the Hawaii Hochi in this campaign for a new trial for Fukunaga, full psychiatric exam. So immediately after he had been sentenced to death, various leaders in the community, Shinto priests, Buddhist priests, Japanese language principals, professionals, heads of business organizations, signed a petition, sent it to Governor Wallace Farrington at this time, asking for a full psychiatric exam. Another racial injustice. It was only 90 minutes. I forgot to mention this. Instead of 10 days, as required by Hawaii law, but 10-day psychiatric exam would have delayed the start of the trial and the immediate execution of Fukunaga as they wanted. Fred Makino hired Robert Murakami, one of just 2 Nisei attorneys, to represent Fukunaga in these appeals of his conviction. So they were filed subsequent to his death sentence on October 8th, and his hanging was scheduled for October 23rd. If not for these appeals, Fukunaga would have been hanged. But after the first appeal failed, then the appeal to the 9th U.S. Circuit Court in San Francisco, then to the Supreme Court, all unsuccessful. But the funding for these appeals, the hiring of the attorneys, not just Fukunaga, Murakami, but 2 other attorneys in San Francisco who filed the appeals in the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals and to the U.S. Supreme Court, came from $7,000 in donations from the Japanese American community. Makino, of course, led the campaign, as I said, criticized the Star Bulletin, the advertiser, and how they wrote about the case, the bias against Fukunaga, the discrimination that they saw in his conviction. They criticized certainly Soga's Nippujiji. The Nippujiji came out in favor of Fukunaga's execution, maintained they had been given a fair trial, treated the same as though he was a Hale himself. And particularly emphasizing for the Hawaii Hochi and Makino the racial dimensions of the case, as opposed to how the Star Bulletin and the Nippujiji maintained Fukunaga was treated the same as anyone else. Being Japanese had nothing to do with his conviction and death sentence. So other forms of resistance. After the conviction, there were these large meetings at Japanese theaters in downtown Honolulu, where Makino would speak, other representatives of the Hawaii Hochi, and subsequent to the last appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, there were more petitions sent to now the governor's Lawrence Judd from Japanese American community leaders. 1,000 mothers signed a petition to Judd requesting commutation of the death sentence to life in prison without parole. After Fukunaga's death, execution, this very large rally was held on the grounds of the Chuogakuen Language School at the intersection of Vineyard and Nuwana Streets. You know, the building is there. Anybody familiar with? Right at the corner. And so there's a picture of that rally at which Makino and another representative of the Hawaii Hochi spoke. This is 4 days after the conviction, or execution rather, of Fukunaga. And I believe it was held outdoors on a Sunday evening and attracted this large crowd, 7,000 people, because they couldn't find a building that could accommodate that large of an audience. You know, as I said previously, they had been holding these mass meetings in Japanese theaters. But after Fukunaga had been convicted, executed, they knew that there was this strong opposition to that in the Japanese community. And that's why I believe they went outdoors. And 7,000 people came out on a Sunday evening to hear Makino speak for the last time about the Fukunaga case.
As opposed to other religions, offer that you would want to convert?
No, as I said, the chaplain at Oahu Prison was a Catholic priest, and that may have been the reason. Because after he had been sentenced to death, he contacted a Japanese minister at the Methodist Church, that Harris Methodist Church, that had a Japanese section. And so that minister spoke to Fukunaga on numerous occasions, shortly after he'd been convicted. But perhaps Fukunaga developed a more personal relationship with his father, Valentin, who was a Catholic, and therefore decided that he would become a Catholic himself. Okay, third one?
Speaking to how vigorous the defense was actually raised at trial, I'm supposing that there was a summation or a conclusion that the defense attorneys were allowed to give. Now, was there any effort on their part to do a Clarence Darrow sort of defense as he did it for Leopold and Loeb, where they rail against the death penalty rather than an acquittal?
No.
No, there was no attempt.
No. You know, they never addressed the question of his insanity. Yeah. One of his attorneys, Eugene Beebe, was much more concerned to provide a defense, a zealous defense, although they both failed him. Yeah? And so Beebe asked the jury in his closing remarks, you have to ask the question, why did he do it? Because based on his mild, if not meek, timid personality, there's no explanation why he would commit such a violent murder. So it had to be something perhaps dealing with his sanity, but they never presented any evidence of his legal insanity. The best they could get, one of the psychiatrists to admit that Fukunaga was mentally abnormal.
Yeah, because Darrow took the position that there's no sense arguing for an acquittal. Instead, I'm going to actually try to save the accused lives by arguing against the death penalty. I'm just wondering how vigorous was that put forth to the jury?
No. You know, because they wanted to get the trial over. Sorry. 4, 5, 6. Cliff. Okay.
Just a quick response to the previous question. As a recovering Catholic, they do offer you life after death if you repent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, John, about the 20,000 number mob that appeared at the police station.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of weeks ago, they estimated about that many people marched on Mauna Kea. And it just seems to me this was an incredible turnout, especially given the population at that time. Could you tell us a little about that, what you know about the motivation and what why so many turned out?
Yeah. The crowd started gathering downtown Honolulu at the police, shortly after the kidnapping, at the police station, at Hawaiian Trust, because they wanted to get the latest news about the case. And on that Saturday, after Fukunaga was taken into custody on Beretania and 4th Street, the car drove to the police station blasting its siren, and people took this to mean that the killer of Gil Jameson had been captured. So people flocked to the police station, the old police station on Bethel Street. Now the building is still there. It's for the city and county of Honolulu. And the crowds were so large that the police were called out to string rope, push the crowds back because of the concern that people might get agitated. No one was calling necessarily to take Fukunaga from police station and hang him, but there was this mob out there, and the police were very concerned something like that might happen, and therefore they pushed the crowds back. But in terms of how people felt, I think most people felt, except for Japanese Americans, he should be hanged and convicted. You know, that was the belief that he would be hanged, convicted and hanged very quickly. Okay, 4, 5, Cliff, and then 6. Yeah, okay, Cliff.
Less.
Huh?
Less.
So-
I,
Oh, sorry, don't you my friend Cliff, that's why.
I wanted to thank you for writing this book because I really don't believe that this case, Mas Fukunaga, is known enough. Like more, you know, almost everybody knows about the Massey cases.
Mhm.
But the Massey case, the Fukunaga case and the Massey case are actually co-joined at the hip.
Mhm.
And you cannot really understand one without, you know, especially the Massey cases, without understanding in the context of Fukunaga case. But then the other thing is, I want to thank you, because when I started reading your book, I was expecting just about this case, but it was actually about the whole climate
Mhm.
leading up to the late 20s and into the 30s. And I think that's the very valuable thing, because maybe you can expound a little bit more about this concept of color blindness
Mhm.
and the dangers of looking at the race relations in Hawaii through this colorblind lens.
Mhm. Mhm. Let me go back to the first point you raised, because in my book, what I do is connect the Fukunaga case to these other cases of racial injustice that occurred earlier in the 1920s against Japanese and Filipino labor leaders because of their leadership in strikes, 1920, 1924. 24 is just Filipinos. So they were convicted on perjured testimony, Japanese and Filipinos, sentenced to several years in prison. When they got out, they left Hawaii. And this is the reason for why they were convicted, so that they would not engage in any more labor organizing of strikes. And Paulis knew by the time of the Fukunaga case, 3 years after Pablo Manlapet, the leader of the Filipino labor union, had been sent to prison, that they could manipulate the criminal justice system and get away with it. And that's why they could engage in such extreme racial injustices that we see throughout the case, including beating the first suspect, Harry Kaisan, trying to get a confession from him. And so, again, after the Fukunaga case, like you say, I also connect in the concluding chapter his case with Kahavai's case. Because, again, they got away with the cases of the Japanese Filipino labor leaders, the Fukunaga case. So in the Kahavai case, it's the commutation of the 10-year sentences to hard labor of the 4 convicted killers of Joe Kahavai just to 1 hour. Okay. Yes? Oh, sorry, colorblindness.
Yeah.
Okay, to make my book academic, I talk about what I call incipient colorblindness and emergent multiculturalism, evident in the case. These are kind of absurd notions in the 1920s. The more significant one is the multiculturalism that emerges during this time. Right? It's the idea you find it present 90 years later. Hawaii as a multicultural paradise where everybody gets along with each other. Right? Hawaii is a multicultural model for the rest of the world. We can learn from Hawaii's experience. But these ideas start in the 1920s. Hawaii as a racial melting pot. Hawaii as a racial paradise. And so in the papers, the Star Bulletin and Nipu Jiji, they criticize the Japanese American community for disrupting the racial harmony that exists in Hawaii, which was of course not the case. So that's how you see this incipient multiculturalism, as I call it, or emergent multiculturalism. Color blindness is the view at present, and it is the dominant racial ideology in America. Race should have no formal significance when it comes to hiring, promotions, college admissions. And in the Fukunaga case, we see the judges, the prosecuting attorneys, both Honolulu dailies, the Nipu Jiji, invoking color blindness when they say, Fukunaga was not judged as a Japanese person, he was treated the same as if he was Haole. Race had nothing to do with his conviction being Japanese, which is again absurd. Yes.
Robert Murakami was my father-in-law, and I talked to him extensively about Fukunaga, as well as the Massey cases. And he says, of course, we don't know where the truth really lies, but he says Biles had no intention of killing the Jameson boy. He said that the boy was a little stouter than he was, and he was trying to subdue him. But he had a hammer, and to try to subdue him, he hit him with the hammer, and that happened. So it seems like, it was not his intent, but we don't know where the truth lies. But that's what he told me.
Okay. Fukunaga had written something, like I said, the schedule, again, maybe it's a missing slide. The night before the crime, he wrote something called Schedule of Undertaking. And on the back page, he wrote, no intent to kill. And one of his attorneys pointed that out to the jury, that perhaps the kidnapping of Gil Jameson was intentional, but not the killing. But when he was interviewed by the police following his capture, they asked him about why did you kill him? And he said, well, I'm working alone. I have to go downtown to send the ransom letter to Gil Jameson's father. It would have been difficult for me to leave him behind, and that's why he killed him.
I think the big thing for the Japanese community was shame.
Yeah.
It was shame,
Mhm.
and that really, and there was not that much support from the Japanese community because they were filled with so much shame.
No support, not much support?
Were they all Japanese though?
I assume they were.
They're Japanese, okay, because if
Why would you go to a rally if you can't understand Japanese? The speeches are all in Japanese, by Makino and Haka.
But this is after though, after.
But there were rallies before, No, the community came out in support. The Nipu Jiji asked Japanese people, why are you contributing to the defense line? Why do you support a new trial for Fukunaga? And they said, it was because he was probably mentally insane. If a Haole kid had committed such a crime, he would have gotten off, but not Fukunaga. No, the Nipu Jiji circulation declined substantially in the fall of 1928 because of their support for the execution of Fukunaga. And the Hoichi increased its subscriptions because of their support of Fukunaga.
Thank you all for being here today. We have his book in the gift shop, and we really hope that you'll you will purchase, those of you who are members will receive your 10% discount, so. And then Professor Okumura will be here to sign your books as well. So we want to thank him for coming today and thank you all as well.